Senior business leaders in Singapore are more concerned about misinformation than they were before the pandemic. And they say that COVID has changed how they consume news. We take a closer look at an online survey by BBC Global News. Joining me live is John Williams. He's Vice President for Singapore and Southeast Asia for BBC Global News APAC. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Michelle. Thank you for having me on.
Good of you to join us. Now, more than 70% of respondents said trustworthiness is the most critical attribute for a news source, more important than objectivity and impartiality. John, the social media age is one of increasing polarization. So does your findings indicate leaders are looking for sources of news they agree with? I mean, how do you define trustworthiness if it's distinct from objectivity and impartiality?
That's a good question. And yeah, you're very right that social media platforms are, huge and omnipotent at the moment. But I think trustworthiness is very much, as research has shown, key for senior business leaders around the region and specifically in Singapore. And trustworthiness for us is really about checking the source of the news that you're basically providing. So whereas social media is a great way to disseminate news, often the sources of those stories are not actually particularly clear. Whereas, we know that for the BBC, for example, all of our stories come from our own journalists. They're triple checked. Not only by our editors, but also by technology as well. So trust, whilst objectivity is key and truthfulness and impartiality from our point of view, but trustworthiness is something that we found that our readers and business users in Singapore rate higher than any other factor.
Now, of the 250 senior business leaders surveyed in Singapore by the BBC, 70% say they are more concerned about misinformation now than they were before the pandemic. John, why is that? Is there more misinformation in Singapore now, or is it perhaps that the awareness of misinformation and the negative impacts that it can have on a business has become sharper?
I mean, it's all of those three, to be fair, Michelle. I don't think Singapore overly suffers from an abundance of misinformation, and I know the government has done a lot there to ensure that misinformation in any way, shape, or form is clamped down on. I just think it's the fact that the pandemic and COVID has created an avalanche of information. Most of it, misinformation or erroneous, and people are just extremely aware now that this misinformation is out there and it's being created and shared at lightning speed, via social media platforms. And of course, senior business leaders, for example, need to make sure that anything that they are sharing is trustworthy, because obviously this very much impacts on their personal brand. So for them, I think working or securing content or sort of securing information from trusted news sources that do not share misinformation is absolutely key. And I think the BBC, with a number of leading other international publishers, already have a disinformation unit basically that shares when disinformation is being published, so that we and other media publishers around the world actually don't promote that disinformation by accident on the platforms that we basically provide for our users.
Now, another statistic that stands out in your findings is that nearly 60% of senior Singapore business leaders say they are consuming more news now than they did before the pandemic. Why do you think this is so?
Well, the news has always been consumed heavily. I guess what's interesting now is that increasingly more and more people are consuming their news online and via apps as well. The reason why they're consuming more is because there's more out there, but also I think that the pandemic has created, again, such a huge volume of news and information that basically people are hungry to find out what's been going on. And the beauty of technology now is that you can source and read news from anywhere around the world on any platform that you have. We all wake up with our phones in our hand and we go to sleep with our phones in our hands, sadly. So it's a fantastic platform for garnering and gathering news. But news has become faster. The news cycle is quicker. And I think for business people as well, they're very much aware that what goes on in the world absolutely affects their business, no matter where they are. So Singapore, I think, by its very nature, has always been a very open society in terms of being interested in finding out what's going on in other parts of the world with news, because it does directly affect Singapore. But I think the pandemic has only exacerbated that situation.
Now, your online survey was conducted in Singapore, Australia, and Hong Kong as well. Did the results in terms of how senior business leaders interact with news differ at all from those in Hong Kong or Australia?
It's a good question. There were slight differences. I mean, I think what was interesting is across all of those three markets, all senior business leaders were concerned about misinformation and ranked things like trustworthiness, transparency, and impartiality very highly. So those things are vanilla across all business leaders across the region. But I think there were slight differences. In Hong Kong, a high percentage of the respondents were sharing news stories more regularly with each other. In Australia, which has actually been more of a traditionally insular news market, just because it's so big and it's such a strong domestic news organization. What's actually been happening in Australia is that senior business leaders have been reaching out and actually actively seeking news from other international sources. So whereas beforehand they may have relied much more on their own domestic news providers to give them all the news that they needed, the pandemic has actually made them realize that Australia, whilst it is an island, it is not an island in the business sense of the word. And actually they definitely need to find out what's going on in other parts of the world, because it directly affects their business, as we can see nowadays.
There's been a lot of discussion as to whether or not with social media, people are increasingly distrusting mainstream media. John, you're BBC's Vice President of Global News for Singapore and Southeast Asia. Will
Yeah.
these survey findings impact how the BBC covers the news in this region, or perhaps how it publicizes or disseminates it?
If anything, I think what the beauty of this report is, it actually just reinforces the strength of organizations such as the BBC, which are effectively founded on impartiality, objectivity, truthfulness. Social media, is not going to go away. Of course it isn't. But the BBC has actually proven that the way that we gather our news, the way that we check our news, and the way that they distribute our news is actually is key, and more importantly, is actually something that people really value, certainly in the business community as well. So I don't think we'll be changing anything. If anything, we'll just be making sure that we stick more to our guns than we ever have done in this this crazy changing world that we're living in at the moment.
He's John Williams, Vice President for Singapore and Southeast Asia, BBC Global News, joining us here on Money FM.
Money FM 89.3.